Good morning from Seoul. Good evening to you in Washington, D.C., and good day for everyone else around the world. My name is James Kim, and I'm the Director of the Center for Regional Studies and Senior Fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. The Asan Institute for Policy Studies is an independent, nonpartisan think tank based in Seoul, committed to undertaking policy-relevant research to foster domestic, regional, and international environment conducive to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and Asia. To this end, we have continued to host meetings such as this one and publish reports, briefs, and books to generate thoughtful debates and discussions on issues of core importance to both national and regional security in and around the Korean Peninsula. Thanks for joining us in this webinar today, where we're joined by distinguished experts from both the United States and Korea to discuss an issue that's been gaining some momentum here in Seoul, especially after the presidential election last month, in which a conservative candidate who was openly critical of the Moon administration's national security policy was elected and is about to be inaugurated in May. There's a sense that South Korea's approach not only to North Korea, but also to the alliance and China, as well as regional engagement, will undergo some change in the next 5 years. The president-elect, Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol, has made it clear that he will double down on the ROK-US alliance and work to use the relationship with the US as the backbone for South Korea's strengthened national security posture against threats like North Korea. While Yoon has been critical of China at times during his campaign, his official policy position on Beijing is less clear for now. Perhaps we can lay the groundwork today with this effort to build out a clear roadmap on China for South Korea by drawing on some well-received wisdom from our expert panel. And on this panel, we have with us Dr. Elbridge Colby. He is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. During 2017 and 18, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, where he also worked to lead the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. He's a well-known figure in Washington, D.C. Within the policy community, with past stints in various think tanks, including CNAS. Dr. Chung-Min Lee is a senior fellow of the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. He's also the university professor at the Institute of Security Convergence at KAIST, and the chairman of the International Advisory Council for IISS in London. Last but not least, Dr. Gil Rosman is the editor-in-chief of the Asan Forum, our flagship e-journal. And he's the author of multiple books, all of which I would have to take up most of our time if I want to name all of them here and now. So I'm not going to do that, but you can look it up. He's the professor emeritus of sociology at Princeton University, where he has taught since 1970. And if I'm not mistaken, he's fluent in Chinese, Russian, and Japanese. I know that he can also read Korean. And maybe some other languages that I missed. You can let us know about that later, Gil. He's worked on China for some time, so we're happy to have him weigh in from Washington on his perspective on the issue we will be discussing today. To start off, let me begin with Bridge Colby before going to Chung-Min and Gil. Bridge, I see that you recently authored a book on the topic for today, which can be easily found at Gyobo Bookstore in Seoul and elsewhere online. I want to use the book as a starting point for our discussion because it provides a real good context for thinking about the topic we have for today. So let's get on with it. First of all, let me just say that I enjoyed reading your book, which, unlike most academic texts, shows how abstract theoretical thinking about strategic interaction actually applies to the real world. I thought your book is a good read for any audience, but it speaks more to two kinds of readers in particular. One is a student who's studying IR and wants to see its relevance in the real world. I think this is a perfect book to see how all that thinking about concepts like balance of power, bandwagoning, alliance commitment, and so on applies in thinking about great power competition today and in national security strategy. Same kind of reader who might benefit from this and actually appreciate the book are ones who want to have a reference point for thinking about how the US might manage great power competition with China. And here I'm thinking about folks in the policy community. Before we go into the thrust of your argument in the book, which I think is pertinent to our topic, can I ask about the genesis of the project? This exactly when you decided that this was something you were going to do, and was there a specific moment or an event where the idea of doing this book just clicked for you, or was this something that developed gradually as part of your work and interest?
Well, sure. Well, first, thank you, James, and thank you to Asan for hosting this and for the invitation to participate on this distinguished panel with Chungmin Lee and Gilbert Roseman. A real pleasure, and with you, a good friend and a very serious scholar. Looking forward to the conversation. To answer your question, actually, I believe that my primary motivation is usually some form of unrequited or incompleted vindication, a desire for vindication. So a lot of it came out of my experience working in the Pentagon in 2017, 2018, working on the National Defense Strategy, which is, as you referred to, really tried to shift the department and the whole defense establishment, and by extension, our allies' focus as well, in varying degrees, to great power competition, above all, China, and we continue to see that being playing out. In fact, I think in important respects, this new national defense strategy of the United States is going to carry forward the 2018 shift. The book, if you will, I think of as kind of my platonic version of the national defense strategy. So, I was the leader of the team that developed it and kind of rolled it out. But obviously, there were bureaucratic compromises along the way, many of which I had to grit my teeth. But you're only one player, and I was not the most senior player. But the book is an attempt to I jestingly say, to kind of lay out some of the arguments that I had to engage in the Pentagon. But it's also to provide. You mentioned the audiences, and this sort of touches my sources of inspiration. I mean, really, what I wanted to do was try to lay out a kind of strategic framework, a conceptual framework, a heuristic, if you will, that I think I'm glad to hear you say students and policy practitioners, but also I think military professionals, frankly, regular citizens. I was actually pleased when I was promoting the book in the United States that I was named Book of the Week for the one of the truckers sort of podcasts. So I was like, I'm really penetrating, which was very, very gratifying. But also, of course, allies. I mean, I think if you particularly want to know, and I have one distinct view. I think it's the right one. I think it will carry the day. Whether it's soon enough, I don't know. But it's certainly, if you want to understand the lay of the land conceptually. And I think what I try to do in the book is kind of one reviewer, I took it as a compliment, but he said the book was clinical and ominous, which he could take as an insult. I took it as a compliment, basically stripping away a lot of the rhetoric and the hand waving and the rules-based international order. Or what are we really about? What are the choices? What's going on? And I make my own decisions, but I think hopefully you can see my work. And you might decide to take a different, or do risk cost benefit balance in a different direction. But that's what I think also for a Korean audience, an Asian audience, gives you very clearly, I think, a sense of the real challenge we face. And that's frankly, it's quite obscured right now with the Ukraine situation. But the fundamental tectonics have not altered at all.
So I think some of the logic of the strategic interaction also applies in some ways in thinking about the Ukraine issue as well. So I didn't think it was completely irrelevant to areas outside of Asia. But your focus clearly is on China. So the topic you cover is very important, obviously, for the United States, but also for countries in East Asia like South Korea. Maybe more so than anywhere else in the world, because it's the area that would be most immediately impacted and also broadly impacted by what you call China's focused and sequential strategy. To set the stage, how would you characterize the China challenge facing the United States and its allies in the region? And I'm asking this question because there's still some people out there who hold on to the belief that China doesn't have a hegemonic ambition. So
sure, yeah. Well, I mean, one piece of data. I mean, I think the Biden administration, which I don't think came in looking to have a confrontational and overall competitive approach to China, I mean, has really continued this, and I think that's because they see the writing on the wall, not because they wanted to. But But I mean, my basic logic is to go back to first principles, and it's a defense strategy book, which is, for a defense strategy to be rational, should be connected to a geopolitical and overall foreign policy strategy. It's not an Asia book. So sometimes people say I'm an Asia first person, but really what I am is a decisive theater first person. So I'm trying to go back to first principles and help Americans and our allies reassess in a condition of what the economists call scarcity. I mean, which is just a situation unlike say 20 years ago, in which we cannot just smother all of the potential threats and problems we face with an overabundance of resources. We just don't have it. Okay, so in that world, what do we focus on and how do we do it? Well, I look at the basic American interests: security, prosperity, and liberty, our own, in an enlightened self-interest way, but nonetheless self-interested. I think that's rational. And I say, what is the real threat to that? Well, the threat to that is an agglomeration of power by some entity in the international system that could undermine our national life. Happy to go into that, but if you look at the world, well, where is that agglomeration? What is the nature? It's economic productivity and development. And if you look at that, the world is economic development is concentrated. It continues to be concentrated in a few places. Basically, the maritime perimeter of Asia, or littorals of Asia, and some in the interior and South Asia, Europe, North America, and to some extent the Persian Gulf. But by far the most significant of these is Asia. And by parenthetically, I mean, this to me is just a fact. But it continues to trigger tremendous resistance in the American and transatlantic conversation, which we can maybe talk about. But I mean, I think it's obvious if you're in Korea. I mean, it's upwards of 50% of global GDP and increasing in that fraction. And there's only one other entity in the international system which could plausibly agglomerate enough power to undermine our national life, and that's China. And the only way it could do that if it had its own power resources and those of Asia. Europe is significant, but it's a secondary theater. It's about 20% of global GDP now, and that's shrinking to about 10% according to the EU itself over the course of the next 20 years. Russia is, as we're seeing, frankly, much smaller, capacity than China. Okay, if this is true, how do we, then that is the concern. That's a theoretical concern. Is China pursuing it? Well, if you look at it as I do from a kind of realistic point of view, not I would say doctrinaire, but just kind of basic, realism, appetite grows with the eating, as the French say. Every culture has its proverb that as somebody grows stronger and richer, their appetite increases. And that's just very basic. And in fact, I think the evidence is in front of us that now I would say it's relatively uncontroversial in most parts of Asia, or in fact, beyond, even in the Biden administration and Europe, that China is pursuing a sort of, I would say, a soft form or a kind of hegemonic, I use the term rather than imperial control, not a direct imperial control, but basically a geoeconomic sphere over which it's dominant. And actually, rationally, I think that's an attractive goal. I mean, I think, we're seeing that, especially in the conditions of the pandemic, we don't live in a flat world, contra Tom Friedman. It pays to be able to marshal sanctions and trade preferences and regulatory preferences and all that. So I think that's what the Chinese are pursuing. Okay, if that's the case, that's our basic foreign policy interest. How do we avoid that? Well, we're not strong or resolute enough to do it on our own, and we're far away from Asia on the whole. Coalition, again, pretty basic. A balancing coalition, not a messianic crusade to transform China, but really basically a balancing coalition that compels China on a prudential basis to reckon with us on terms of respect that we can satisfy, or that are tolerable. So far, so good. And in fact, I think that's actually coming together, and hopefully the new government in South Korea, I mean, I don't want to comment on South Korea's internal matters, but I certainly think it's encouraging that the new South Korean government will be more open to these things. Quad is one, gets talked about a lot. AUKUS is another. Japan's growing relationship with Australia, et cetera. We can go on. I mean, to me, I think of it as an anti-hegemonic coalition. That's more of a mental model than a Procrustean kind of structure. That's all good. That's happening. But the problem is, as you mentioned, James, China has a reaction if it's serious about pursuing this dominant regional position, which I think it is, which is what I call a focused and sequential strategy. And this is basically, instead of precipitating a total conflict or confrontation with everybody assembled at maximal levels of resolve altogether, like say Hitler did or Napoleon in his later stages, rather you pick apart this coalition, you try to collapse it without paying the full cost. And I think the rational way you would do that is through focus and sequential. So you go after vulnerable targets in sequence, and then you basically cause a run on the bank. And I think it's a good strategy. And I think China's so far been pursuing it, largely trying it out through non-military means. So what they're doing to Australia right now, I mean, everybody's in Asia has felt, and beyond has felt this. The good news is that I don't think that's actually succeeding for the Chinese, and I don't think it's going to. I think the limits of economic sanctions, we appreciate it now. I mean, we'll see in Russia, but we can go into it. But I mean, look at the limits of our sanctions on North Korea and Cuba and so forth. That's the good news. The bad news is that China has other instruments, and particularly military power. So I agree with Chairman Mao on this point, which is that power ultimately comes out of a barrel of a gun. If you really want to convince somebody to do something they don't want to do, there's no better way than lethal force. And they are building, in fact, they've already built and are continuing to expand and build a military to pursue this strategy with military force. And in fact, beyond, they're building a power projection military. So, I mean, one of the things about a military buildup is it's one of the most reliable signals. In fact, I think it is the most reliable signal of future intent, because intent change, leaders change, et cetera. But if somebody's building a military to do something, and you can build militaries to do certain different things, that tells you a lot about how they will act in terms of probability. And they're building a military to project military force. And this is very relevant to South Korea, and I'll come back to that in a second. But this tells me that they are more and more, and I mean, just looking at Xi Jinping and his body language and what he says, it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination. They're going to be prepared to use military force. How would they do this? How would they apply the focused and sequential strategy? Well, paradoxically, I think their best strategy is to go after somebody linked to the Americans, because the Americans are the only power, just from a power point of view, strong enough to serve as what I think of as the cornerstone balancer of this coalition. The coalition will not survive without the Americans for a variety of reasons, largely to do with power. I mean, Japan and South Korea don't get along. India and Japan are far away. There's a lot of coordination problems. So you need the Americans. Okay, if that's true, but you don't want to fight the Americans in a huge war altogether, how do you do it? You go after countries connected to the Americans, but that are vulnerable within the coalition. And to me, there's basically three of them that pop out: Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And the best initial option is Taiwan, because it's vulnerable. They have the best case. The Taiwans have been laggard. The Philippines are behind them. That's the second best, but the South Koreans are in bronze place. We can get to that in a second. But how would the Chinese pursue this? Some variant of a fait accompli, basically, just to be kind of telegraphic. The best way to achieve, and I think actually the Ukraine situation is vindicating this point, the best way to do this is actually the decisive, overwhelming, direct application of military force. As Napoleon put it, if you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. Don't get into coercion, don't get into bombardment or blockade. Leaves too many variables out there. If you're China, go across the strait, flatten them, and create a situation which the Americans then have the onus of escalation onto us. Unfortunately, not only is it a good strategy, but according to Admiral Davidson and now Admiral Aquilino and others, there's a very real possibility they may already be able to do it, according to the Taiwan defense minister, and it's certainly getting worse. So this is the background. There's no other problem in the world that is of comparable significance for America, and of course I think for South Korea as well, I would surmise. So our defense and foreign policy need to adapt accordingly, and our priority should be to deny China regional hegemony over Asia by being able to defend Taiwan alongside Taiwan's own efforts. And because if we can defend Taiwan, we can defend Japan and the Philippines. South Korea is a little bit trickier, but basically it's a pretty good rule of thumb, and South Korea spends a lot on defense, has a very formidable conventional military, and everything else should take a back seat. So when we were in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, this is what we shifted to. We shifted to primarily a one war force planning construct. And what this meant basically was, before you worry about North Korea, Iran, whatever, make sure we win the China fight. The problem is that we're not winning the China fight. And this is being obscured right now by the Ukraine situation. The situation has not improved in Asia, and we're acting as if it does. Maybe briefly, I'll say what this means for South Korea. I think we're going to basically have to focus on the Western Pacific and the first island chain, and take a more, I think of it as a variant of the Nixon doctrine, a kind of supporting role in the other theaters, including Europe, where we should remain in NATO, but take a more limited role, and the Europeans should be responsible primarily for their own conventional defense, the Abraham coalition in the Middle East, and then the Indians in South Asia. And then our focus should be on the first island chain, surely militarily, but also this will have relevance in terms of the deployment of our political and diplomatic capital. I think the key scenario is Taiwan. I think from a defense planning point of view, my view is that the military threat to South Korea will increase over the next 10 years. I mean, if the Chinese can invade Taiwan, they can invade South Korea. I mean, it's 100 miles from the Shandong Peninsula to South Korea. They've got the air. I mean, they could always come down through North Korea again. That's complicated, but they can move that capacity well within the time frame that if we weren't prepared for us to respond. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing here that invasion and annexation are two different things. So in the case of Taiwan, I think the threat is annexation. So the Taiwanese should be worried about living under the Chinese boot. I think in the case of the Philippines and South Korea, more likely what China would want is to leverage that the most formidable and compelling form of military force to achieve a kind of a disaffiliation of South Korea from the American alliance network. And of course, you also face North Korea. So I think in reality, American military is going to have to be really focused on the PLA. And in my view, the bulk of the responsibility, the great bulk of the responsibility for conventional defense of South Korea against the DPRK is going to have to be with Iraq. That's the future reality. But again, these kind of particular puts and takes, I think I don't claim to have the last word on, but this is when we're looking out, unless China collapses, I think that's the future that we're grappling with.
So, I think you kind of really presented a very comprehensive overview on everything you say in the book, actually. So Asia is growing and China is a big part of that. And as China grows and in terms of its capabilities, its ambitions can also, grow, even if some of these naysayers say that China does not have these ambitions. And one way to respond to this is, as you point out, prioritizing and doing the right kinds of things that U.S. has already been doing over the last two administrations. How would you put the overall, how would you diagnose the overall situation right now in East Asia in terms of how well the countries in the region are doing to address the China challenge in the formation of, your ideal anti-hegemonic coalition, let's say, and how's the U.S. Managing this competition, in your opinion? Would you say the Biden administration is on the right track, doing the right things to best address this issue, or do you think there needs to be some changes? And what can the U.S. and the allies like South Korea do to address this challenge?
So I think the situation is extremely grave. And I think we're on a trajectory to failure. And this is, people ask me how well was the 2018 National Defense Strategy implemented? And I say, well, in comparison to the preceding defense strategy documents, very well. Like many of them were just ignored. So people actually took this one seriously. But compared to what China's been up to, we're behind. So we're not racing against ourselves. And if I'm right, that at the end of the day, the military situation will be determinative if it's not prepared for. And I stress, just to be clear, I stress that my point is a stable peace here, is to prepare for war in order to avoid it. Just to be very clear, and happy to go into that. But you mentioned something, James, and that's why I made that hand motion, is that not to be disrespectful, but there's been a lot of talk about pivoting to Asia, but it's never really happened. It's never gone through the trouble of actually happening. And that's certainly in the military. For instance, our military posture in the Western Pacific has essentially not changed in the last 10 years, despite a lot of talk, which essentially hasn't changed in the last 20 years or 15 years, really. So this is very bad because the Chinese military threat has grown literally by orders of magnitude. I mean, in terms of the scale. I mean, 30 years ago, Okinawa was not under threat. Now Okinawa is essentially hopeless. And even Guam and aircraft carriers and all these things and bases in Japan. And the Chinese scale of missiles is so great that it can kind of saturate a lot of our bases. And our logistics structure is very poor. I don't know if you saw, I mean, just a recent anecdote, the Pentagon is going to shut down the fuel tanks in Hawaii. Well, I mean, you still need fuel to get across the Pacific unless you're operating on nuclear power. So, that's another setback. So this is at the symbolic level, we're doing pretty well, but this actually makes me worried. And this is my criticism of I have a number of criticisms of the Biden administration. I think what they've done well is they've recognized that the relationship with China necessarily has a confrontational aspect, because to me, in order to get to a stable position, we need to reset expectations, both the Chinese and others, that we're not going to be pushed around, that they're not inevitably dominated, and they're not going to be able to take us all down. I also think their defense strategy appears to prioritize China and Asia, as far as I can tell so far. So that's good. They've mentioned Taiwan as the pacing scenario, so that's good. The problem is a couple things. One is they are underinvesting in hard power, and they are overinvesting in rhetorical and symbolic issues. So a Quad meeting at the end of the day, not going to really do that much for China unless it's connected to something material. It's suggestive, but it's not. When people say should we create an Asian NATO, I say no. I wouldn't even want an Asian NATO, because the political capital required to achieve that would be better spent on increasing defense capacity and other measures, and societal resilience. And so the fact that there's, Secretary Blinken's out there doing a lot of meetings, it's not bad, but it's not as good as they think, and it's taking attention away from what does need to happen. And if you look at their defense budget, it's not the defense budget of a country that's saying we are about to lose for the first time in our history to a great power. And by the way, a great power that is significantly larger, relatively speaking, than any other great. We alone were larger than Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, let alone when you pile on the British Empire and the Soviet Union. We were much larger than the Soviet Union. We were larger than Imperial Germany. This is not the case. So the situation is, and this is why, and I get flack in the United States and in Europe for this, but there's a sort of, hey, there's a wide sense, oh, we can't afford to prioritize, we can't afford to choose, that's unbalanced. And it's like, the example I use is the China threat is like in a case of acute heart disease, which is, it's a long-term problem, but it'll kill you if you don't take care of it immediately. And also, if you've got acute heart disease and you've got tennis elbow and you've got like a problem with your shoulder, well, what do you take care of, with your limited time and money? I mean, our healthcare system has its problems, but you know what I mean? Hopefully you don't, but like, you're going to focus on that first, right? And that's the thing. And that's not really what is happening. So at this point, I think we might have to have a Ukraine situation before there's a real wake-up call, but there's no buffer in Asia. I mean, if Taiwan were to fall, Japan and the Philippines would be under direct threat. I mean, Luzon is 100 miles from Taiwan. And just briefly, James, I don't want to go on too long, but on the question of China's hegemonic ambitions, I think it's pretty clear that they want to dominate the region. I don't know. I mean, everybody can see the facts, but I think the other thing is that prudence requires that any entity that's that strong needs to be balanced. I mean, in fact, that's the kind of the core of the American system of government, which is that nobody should have too much power. And, if China agglomerate, it will be a kind of, not to be whatever, archaic, but it'll be a middle kingdom just by necessity. And even if Xi Jinping is not going to be, which I think he is, but even if Xi Jinping is restrained, a future leader is going to come along and say, well, this sounds pretty great. I'm going to push the line. And you know why we know that? Because that happened to the United States. The United States was pretty restrained in the Cold War when we were checked by other power, but we got really hubristic. People might like what we were trying to do, but we were, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton. I mean, we were really hubristic. So I think if it happens to us, why would I expect it to happen differently to the Chinese?
Okay, I think you laid out the immediacy of the problem, how big it is. Maybe we're even perhaps behind the curve on addressing this challenge. I have more questions, but I'm gonna hold on to them and turn the mic over to Chungmin and Gil and get their perspective as they're thinking about this from the regional point of view. And I'll go with you, Chungmin, first. What do you think about this challenge and the case that Bridget's kind of laid out for us here? From a regional point of view, and also, for South Korea, and any other opinions or comments you might have on your reading of the book.
Well, thank you, James, for bringing a very good group together. I think I met Bridge at a couple of seminars in DC several years back when I was at Carnegie, although I'm still there, but working remotely from Seoul. And of course, Gil I've known for many, many years, and we continue to work together. So great to see all of you gentlemen. I think any author who writes on this subject is bound to be overdriven by the fact that, we have Ukraine, that's on the news cycle 24/7. But if you take that aside for a while, I think what Bridge does point out is that the threat of war, the threat of hegemonic, I guess, ambitions on the part of China, what's happening in Russia, these are all critical issues that we all have to seriously think about. And beyond, editorials or platitudes you see in newspapers. So the two big takes that I got from your book, Bridge, was that number one, geopolitics is certainly not dead. This is something that I think, we talk about climate change and AI and the fourth industrial revolution, and the list goes on. And those human security concerns and other concerns are crucial. But of course, geopolitics is back with a vengeance. And I think that's one point that you that emphasize. The second point that I got from your book is, China is not your normal great power because she has economic prowess, unlike, for example, the former Soviet Union. So when we talk about China or counterbalancing China, it's not just military aspects that are crucial, but what other means you bring to bear. So those are the key points that I got from your book. One thing that there are a couple of questions that I had, and apropos of what James said, what concerns me most from the perspective of Korea and for someone who has studied and lived in the US for a long time is, number one, what is the American political purpose and ability to forge a workable grand strategy? And I know that you served in the Trump administration, so there are pluses and minuses, I'm sure, from your view. But what I didn't see in your book is, if I'm not mistaken, there was not a single mention of Donald Trump, in the sense that I think he did more, this is just my personal take, I think he did more damage to the US ROK alliance and NATO as a sitting US president than any other person that I can recall. Now, you can have different takes on this. But if you have a US president who says, oh, you know what, I want to blow up the alliance. I love Kim Jong-un. Why not give Japanese and Koreans, nuclear weapons if they really want to? Yeah, let's make sure that these guys really pay up their hosting support by over $5 billion. And then the list goes on and on and on. And of course, you can take that as optics. All presidents are in the business of show business, and Trump is not unique in that sense. But I think the damage that he did psychologically to the alliance is in many respects not irreparable, but the damage was very, very severe. So going forward, I want to ask, my first question to you is, given the political divisiveness you see in Washington, and from the outside, if you see the rioters on the Hill on January 6th, you have a U.S. president who refuses to basically say he lost the election. He refuses to this day to say, I lost the election. And so if you have that mob in the Congress, and then you see from the outside, well, gosh, what is the American ability to forge a bipartisan grand strategy? Because as you correctly point out, China is the big gorilla in the room. And so that's one big question that I have for you. The second point is, you also mentioned that if, for example, we consider strategic options because the US can't be at all places at the same time, you mentioned in passing the possibility of so-called friendly proliferation. And I think that really will strike people's nerves here in both a good and bad way, because I think there's been growing South Korean public opinion support for having their own nuclear weapons. And so you basically hit a very important issue. But that also, I think, causes a lot of consternation, because it also signals a weakening of the American US nuclear umbrella. On the good side, the Biden administration, I think, as I read in the press, have moved away from sole purpose doctrine, so that because of intense pressures from NATO, from Japan, from South Korea, and even the Australians, I think they are stepping back. So the nuclear umbrella, extended deterrence, I think, will remain in place for the time being. but nobody really knows what will happen in a future administration. So my second question to you is, if you have friendly proliferation, that will also open up a new can of worms. And so, there are people in South Korea who really want their own nuclear weapons, but as I always tell them, the moment you go nuclear, the moment South Korea goes nuclear, you will have the Chinese and the Russians target South Korea with nuclear weapons like never before. And so there is going to be an intensive arms race beyond the conventional arms race that we see, that overall I think will be highly destabilizing. And so I think the friendly proliferation option might be good in some respects, but I think it really does have very negative proliferation and stability concerns over the longer term. My third question, at least in the first round, is this, and that is, if you look at alliance management over the last 70 plus years, I think the real success story is the fact that you have a number of American allies that have fairly robust capability, military, economic, technology, et cetera. And that's something that President Biden wants to do with a techno-democracy alliance. But if you look down at the granular level, for example, I think very soon we have elections in the Philippines. And Ferdinand Jr., Marcos Jr., nicknamed Bongbong, as you know, is likely to win the election. And what he has done in his home province, which his family has ruled for the last 40 odd years, is Ilocos Norte is going to become, in some respects, a Chinese economic colony. And so if that's the case, if he pulls China closer to the Philippines, I think that will be much more damaging to US force posture in the Western Pacific than anything that China could do in terms of, like, for example, invading the Philippines. So again, I think domestic determinants is critical. For example, my last point is, if Lee Jae-myung of the current ruling party in Korea, if he won the election, we would be having a very different webinar today. And the US would have a very different sense of priorities if another progressive government were to be in power in Korea for the next 5 years. So again, I think the good news is we have a conservative government in place, in my personal opinion, who knows all these issues. But at the same time, who knows what's going to happen in 5 years' time. So you will always see this perturbation. And so the only countries where alliances are sustained, regardless of domestic change, I think, is Canada, the UK, and Australia. And so outside of those countries, you'll see lots of changes politically. And maybe I would also include Japan, because Japan has been fairly consistent in that sense. So those are the 3 or 4 main points that I had. But I've written only a couple of books compared to Gil Rosman, but I give you kudos, Bridge, because anybody who was an academic like yourself, but then you entered government service and had a high position, it takes a lot of time and effort to write this really great book. And so kudos to you for launching us into this great debate. And I really hope that aspects of your denial strategy will be implemented in a bipartisan way. Thank you.
Jungmin, I would have to say that, if you're trying to compare, prolificness of your productivity and book writing, I would come in last on this panel. But domestic politics in both the United States, potential partners and allies in Asia, this balance that you talked about and you thought about, Bridge, in your book, pro-hegemonic bandwagoning coalition versus the anti-hegemonic balancing coalition. And then the second really important question about proliferation. I think we're seeing some changes also in Japan even that signals that the public is more inclined than in the past to consider the nuclear option. Any thoughts?
Sure. Well, thank you, Chung-Min, and good to see you again. I'll try to address, I think, the three questions. The first is on the impact of President Trump. I mean, first I'll say, as an American, I'm a conservative. I supported President Trump. I think he did a lot of great things. And I mean, more to the point, if you're an observer of American politics, you'll see that there is intense partisanship and disagreement, and that many people on the spectrum very much want that kind of approach. And there's a reason that President Trump was elected. And in fact, President Biden is less popular right now in his term than President Trump was at that point. And it looks like the Republicans, I mean, my personal view, knock on wood, will sweep in the midterm elections. So these are domestic issues. And I think, looking at it kind of half as an American, but half, looking at it trying objectively, my admonition to you would be to say, look, this happened for a reason, which is, I mean, I go back and I think a lot of the disasters and the problems that we've encountered started in the 1990s or really in the early 2000s with the hubris that I mentioned, that go back to the Bush administration, neglecting China, the disastrous Middle East wars, the financial crisis, et cetera. And President Trump, in some sense, was a reaction to what many people call the Uniparty, right? Which was the kind of neoliberal ascendancy. And there was a kind of cri de coeur from the American people. There's a comparable sentiment in parts of the left. And actually, a lot of President Trump's voters were not traditional Republican voters, right? So we'll see how the American political spectrum develops. I would just say, I just don't think what you're saying is correct, Chungmin. Actually, now, South Korea was very contentious relationships, although Republican governments and left-wing governments in South Korea tend to have pretty difficult relationships, and from what I can tell. But American relationships under the Trump administration with Japan were quite good, with Taiwan were quite good, actually, to some extent with the Philippines, Vietnam, India, many Southeast Asia countries, certainly Australia, the Middle East countries. So it's largely about, frankly, South Korea under the Moon government and Europe, and particularly Northern and Western Europe, not necessarily Poland or some of the Balkan countries. But obviously, President Trump's a controversial figure. I don't deny that. But I just think we need to look at this actually more realistically. The other thing is, yeah, there's a lot of divisiveness in American political life, but I actually don't see the evidence that it's inhibiting us from recognizing China. In fact, probably the one material thing that Republicans and Democrats agree on is that China is the main problem. I was out at the Reagan Defense Forum in December, and Republicans have been trending tougher on China for a couple of years, but it's been striking that the Reagan Defense Forum's poll suggested that it had also risen significantly under Democrats. And I think that's partially because of the difficulties that the Biden administration has had. In some ways, it might have been, I mean, this is kind of the Edward Luttwak point, the sort of pliable approach that the Biden administration tried a little bit earlier on was kind of responded to with a sort of a slap on the face. And that's kind of alienated Democrats in the United States as well. And it gets into deeper issues of deindustrialization and so forth. But, you've heard my criticisms of the Biden administration, but I give them, I mean, Blinken has said when he was being nominated, I'm going to continue the Trump administration's policy on China. And the opposition party in the United States is tougher on China than the Democrats are. So, I mean, and, I think if we look historically, yeah, there's a lot of disputes in America. And I don't want to, look, I think America has a ton of problems. I'm not saying we're perfect, far from it. But I mean, think back to the 70s or late 60s. I mean, there were mass riots, there was social discord, there was breakdown of law and order, there were huge, the problems around Vietnam. You go back to the interwar years, Great Depression, the bonus army, widespread disobedience, the period after the First World War, or the labor strikes in the pre-World War I era. America's it's not like a neat and tidy country traditionally. So, the crime rate is actually historically low. It's going up, which people are angry about. That's one of the reasons why the Republicans are doing better. Inflation is, the economy is doing better than most of the other OECD economies over the last couple of decades. But inflation is high. Again, that's why the Republicans are benefiting. But in terms of China, I actually think the macro direction of travel is pretty good on a bipartisan. And that's why I said the national defense strategy that these guys are releasing, the contours seem pretty good. So I'm mostly, or the sort of direction of travel, I would say is pretty good. I'm mostly objecting to some of the specific, how far they're going, the specific puts and takes, the level of effort. But within a context that I think is actually fairly decent. And I think from South Korea's perspective, look, the point I want to make, and if I were advising President Trump, I would say, look, you don't have to come down always like a ton of bricks. Here's the point. Alliances are not love affairs. They're not friendships. They're like private business partnerships, right? And actually, I was always a little mystified because South Korea spends a lot on defense, but it's crazy that the Germans were spending 1% of it. It's insane that they were doing it. It's insane that they had this level of exposure to the Russian gas and oil market. And now we're seeing the effects, which is the point that President Trump was making. But similarly with Japan, I'm very tough on the Japanese. Why? It's insane that they're spending so little. So, we should be able to have, and we got out of this business during the Cold War, as you know, there were some pretty contentious issues over deployment of forces in the peninsula, in Europe, the balance of payments crisis issue. This is something where it would be good if we could get a little bit of a balance, but away from the world of like, we're America, we solve all your problems. And this gets to your second point, Chungmin, which is about friendly nuclear proliferation. Look, American resolve is not limitless. I mean, if Americans decide that we are, and I mean, frankly, Biden's decision on Afghanistan was a demonstration of that. If Americans are put in a position where it's crazy for us to do something, we're probably not going to do it. We shouldn't do it. So the whole logic of my book is to anticipate what that might be, adapt accordingly so we don't get to that point. So as you may recall, I'm critical of friendly nuclear proliferation, not really for the non-proliferation shibboleth aspects, which I'm kind of less concerned about, frankly, but I actually don't think it will work for South Korea. I think if South Korea got nuclear weapons and you alienated the Americans, you would be alone and the Chinese would still have enormous pressure over you. I mean, South Korea is in terrible geography. You are a battlefield. So you're either protected along with us, or you're in this no man's land, or you're with the Chinese, because you can't get out of this central front. And so I think when I was talking about friendly, our first order of business is conventional denial. And that's what I'm focused on. That's what I'm beating the Japanese up all the time about, is that's what we need to get. So we don't have to go. If we fail at that, we may have to look at friendly nuclear proliferation, but probably what it will look like is more like the UK or nuclear sharing of the Cold War era, like more meaning. Today it's largely symbolic. But I mean, that's the kind of thing. But South Korea, I think there's a tendency, my impression is in the South Korean conversation, to suggest that, oh, we'll get nuclear weapons and we'll be totally secure. No, because like you're not, I mean, you're still going to, the problem with that is you're not going to commit suicide realistically, rather than accept limited Chinese political demands. And by the way, they're likely to have the capability to preempt and blunt a lot of your retaliatory capability. So what are you going to do if they say, well, disaffiliate from the American alliance and kowtow to Beijing, and you're going to blow up Beijing? No, you're not going to do that, because they'll kill you all. And they will. They're not going to. So and this is a point I've made to the Australians too. The only hope for us all is to work together in this collective model and have a model of denial. And if we have to fall back to some kind of friendly nuclear proliferation, which is not attractive, it'll probably be of an integrated sort. The last point on the Philippines, I mean, I don't agree with you that it's more dangerous than the Chinese, but this is where the problem is because we're already behind. I mean, people talk about the advantages of the defense in the modern military context. Look at Ukraine. The Ukraine is surviving because the Ukrainians were there and they were sufficiently ready. The problem with today is that we're not ready. The Philippines is basically a free zone because they kicked us out in the early 90s. And we've never actually been able to get back in. And our force posture in the region is not adapted sufficiently. So this means that the Chinese do have offensive advantages. And they're building a Marine Corps, they're building air assault, they're building a naval force and air forces in space to go and project power. I mean, as somebody pointed out to me, I did an event in the Philippines a couple of weeks ago. The air attacks on the Philippines in December 1941 were launched from Formosa. So I mean, the range of modern aircraft is not radically different from what it was in World War II. So this is kind of what we're dealing with. But this means the point I guess I would conclude with, and what I'm trying to do in South Korea too, is inject. It's a difficult and uncomfortable conversation to have, to reckon with this reality. But if we don't reckon with it now, we won't be able to later. And it's the same in the Philippines. I mean, obviously different levels of development, but I think if we think about it, if we think about 2030 together, maybe 2025 realistically, we're more likely to get to a good place where it never happens than if we wait until that point.
Just quickly, James, before you turn to Gil, I'm sure Gil has lots to say. I have never advocated that South Korea should go nuclear for all the reasons that you've just pointed out. And so in terms of beefing up deterrence capabilities, we have to go through the route of, for example, more, I guess, longer range and more capable missiles, greater missile defense, and tighter defense cooperation with the US and also partially with the Japanese. But as I said, that will happen under the Yoon government, but 5 years down the road, and if the progressives come back to power again, then of course things will shift. And so all I'm saying is that political forces are going to have a much deeper impact on how we forge whether it's a conservative government or a progressive government. Any anti-China coalition or strategy is going to be buffeted by political forces. And that's something that we have to take into account depending on what your election cycle is. And then you've got to take into account whatever happens locally here in Asia.
Well, let me, sorry, and Gil, forgive me for just, because I think it's an important point. There was a review actually by Jessica Matthews in Foreign Affairs, a Capsule Review, and she accused the book of not being sensitive to the desire of countries to avoid the choice issue, you know, the common point mantra about we don't want to have to choose. And I mean, you can criticize the book, but that is not a valid criticism, because actually a huge part of what I was doing in the book was to try to avoid overweighting political relationships that won't sustain it. So this is not CETO. This is not, hey, are you with us or against us? Like sign up, sign here. This is, okay, what are the countries that we need and that we need to be able to defend and that need an alliance commitment? And then what are the countries that we can work with separately, say India and maybe hopefully Vietnam? And then what are countries that we can kind of leave aside for the time being, like Thailand, even though it's notionally an ally, Indonesia. Like Indonesia from a military point of view would be a fantastic ally, but they're never going to sign up for it unless things radically change. They're going to keep free riding. So that leads me to be kind of conservative on the defense perimeter. South Korea is a little trickier given the points you make, although you do a lot more on the defense side. Japan is more consistent politically, but has done a lot less on the defense side. So, you know, there are problems in different places. The Philippines, we need to, anyway. So I'm very acutely concerned about that. Some of the thing about the military denial capability will relieve the dilemmas that we might face. Like one of the reasons why it's worth defending Taiwan is that the alternatives, if we lose Taiwan and have to compensate for its loss, both kind of militarily and in sort of geoeconomic terms, but also from a political point of view, is what are we going to say? We're going to go to Vietnam and say, hey, sign up as an ally, you know, in this, you know, but then people are going to be wondering, well, you guys didn't defend Taiwan. So this is not a good outcome. Better for us to hold the perimeter in maritime Asia, which is where we're strongest, in South Korea being a peninsula.
So Gil, the exchange I thought was very fruitful. I think, you know, when I read the book, what I got out of it mainly was that you were laying out strategically what's at stake for all of the actors, and in terms of the choice that they need to make, you know, what kinds of choices they would make, and being a little bit more clear about what kind of choices, you know, going into extensive detail about what kinds of choices the U.S. would make under different scenarios. And I thought that was one of the, you know, it was helpful getting an insight into the logic behind that strategic thinking. Gil, I want to, after your comments and Bridges' response to your comments, I wanted to open up the questions to the audience. And if you want, you can post your questions in the chat box, or you can start thinking about them, because after Gil's comments and Bridges' response, we'll go to you guys for that. So Gil?
James, thank you for your comments about my meager language skills. And Chongmin, I write a lot, but nobody reads it, so it's not such a big deal. And I also take this hint about we need commentaries and questions to mean I shouldn't speak very long, and I will follow that instruction.
No. You have a lot of time. I just wanted to get these guys warmed up. So you know, well, you don't have.
Well, I'm warmed up, and the first thing I will say is there are two really strong points to the book and the presentation. One is, yes, the China challenge is tremendous. It needs to be taken very seriously, and that's what we are discussing. They seek regional hegemonism, a Sino-centric region, and this is, it takes on new light in the context of the support for what Russia's doing in Ukraine and China's rationale for supporting Russia in this war effort. The second strong point is Taiwan is the test case. Strong defense of Taiwan is warranted, and accentuating that issue is deserving with a military emphasis. Now, I don't like the partisan nature of the comments and the partisan essence of the book, because I think that should be a bipartisan theme. I think the Biden administration came in intently interested in competing with China, making that the priority. Rush Doshi's Long Game book is one indication of that. So I don't think it's in the interest of building the response needed to deal with China and our regional challenges to accentuate the partisan issues here. I also don't think the military agenda suffices for what is called a comprehensive security framework. Comprehensive means to understand the issues that impinge on the security decisions that relate to China's hegemonic aspirations. Those issues have a heavy economic component. And on page 144 of the book, it's specifically stated that China is unlikely to be pursuing territorial conquest. It's seeking domination in other ways, except for Taiwan in the first place. Even in the case of South Korea, I would say there's so many other ways China can influence the atmosphere, whether through use of North Korea or economic pressure, that it really needs to be, these issues need to be discussed in a different framework. So I think the framework is one-sided, not comprehensive in any way. How do we meet the China challenge? So once we've decided that there is that challenge, it seems to me the bridge is talking about three ways. One is to boost US credibility in Asia. Well, in my view, Biden has gone a lot further than Trump in boosting that credibility. So but I don't want to get into the partisan discussions here. We agree that that credibility should be boosted. The second is to forge an anti-hegemonic coalition. Well, how do you forge a coalition? You work with the countries that, as they are, what are their concerns? A lot of them are hedging. A lot of them have very strong economic dependencies on China. I don't see how you forge that coalition simply by concentrating on military security. That is a big part of it. And now with the Ukraine war, it's more on the consciousness of many. But it seems to me a strategy for forging a coalition has to be quite different from what is indicated here. And the third is to counter China's efforts to persuade states to accept it. Well, now we get into my territory. I'm really keen on efforts to how do you persuade states? How do you deal with public opinion? How do you deal with mutual perceptions of states? And I don't see that in the book. I don't see a strategy for persuading states. Now, as far as the states that are singled out, not as the immediate three targets of Taiwan, Philippines, and South Korea, but as the states that might be sort of swing states. A good deal is said about Russia here, and I think it's so far-fetched given the Sino-Russian relationship and the strength of that relationship. And the idea now, as we see, the Ukraine war really calls into question many of the assumptions about how we could find a way to work with Russia to challenge China. I do understand there's some differences between China and Russia. I've studied this question for 50 years and written very extensively on it since majoring in Chinese and Russian studies. So I follow this very closely, but I just don't see the idea that we can deal sort of either by putting Russia aside as a secondary concern because China is so important, not when China is supporting Russia's war, and Russia's war is a test of US resolve and the willingness of US alliances to respond, and the US response to the Ukraine war in Asia has been far-reaching and deserves a great deal of emphasis. The strengthening of US-Japan ties, the shift in South Korea's approach on economic sanctions, and the really big shift in Japan's approach to Russia that's occurred just in the last couple of months. So there's a lot going on with Russia and the Sino-Russian relationship, and North Korea as supported by China and Russia in some sense, that really needs to be discussed in a different context. And these issues are not, the socialist legacy triad is not handled in a way in the book that helps us understand how we can deal with China, because China alone is not the challenge. We have a multiple challenge from a set of 3 countries, each of which is doing something that could be linked up with the others. And we have to understand how China uses North Korea and maybe use it in Russia. Now, there are a few terms in the book that are worthy of clarification or presentation more fully. One is the term of hegemony. What is a Chinese hegemony? And since hegemony is not usually seen as a strictly security term, certainly when the Chinese talk about American hegemony, they don't think of it in those terms. We need to have a broader understanding of what China's trying to do and what is the nature of the hegemony that has to be challenged. Another term that's missing a great deal is multilateralism. How does the US build coalitions of countries to work together when they are reluctant? And term like persuasion, how do you get countries to do what you want them to do? And finally, I want to bring up India, because it seems to me we just seen India's response to the Ukraine war, what a challenge it is for the US to swing India more fully into some kind of anti-hegemonic coalition. We've just seen Wang Yi's visit to India, where he's tried to do something to mend relations. I don't believe they will be mended, but I do think India has been pretty recalcitrant to join very strongly with the US emphasis on turning the Quad into more of a security group. So I think the level of discussion of India, Russia, and especially for the purposes of this group, South Korea, just isn't what's necessary to talk about achieving some kind of anti-hegemonic coalition and dealing with a comprehensive framework rather than a narrow defensive framework, which justifiably starts with Taiwan, but must go much further. I'll stop there because we must have a discussion.
Okay, Bridge, you want to address those?
Great. Well, yeah, and I'll be brief because I see there are a lot of really good questions building up in the chat. I mean, Gil, you obviously have a quite different view of international relations. I just on the partisanship issue, Chung Min asked me a direct question about President Trump, so I gave it. I mean, my criticisms of the Biden administration's conduct are not partisan. It's not like something you'd see in like a fundraising ad. And in fact, there are Democrats who share these critiques. And in fact, I think there are members of the administration who probably, if they were subjected to a lie detector test, would probably agree with me. So the other thing that I would say about partisanship is I actually think there's an element in which it's good that China and these Asia issues have become more partisan. For a long time, Asia, after the Vietnam and so forth, Asia policy was pretty bipartisan, but that actually I think was a reflection of the fact that it was kind of a backwater. And now China is seen as the central issue. And so it is political. So it became political in the presidential election, but that's good because it suggests the parties are competing over it and they think it's important. So obviously that can go overboard. But I think the fact that I don't think we should pine for these sort of salad halcyon days of bipartisanship on, you know, I mean, I know a lot of these people and they get along and stuff, but those days are gone because it's too important now to be, it's too political, and that reflects its importance. I mean, I just fundamentally disagree with your assessment of the international politics. I mean, persuasion is important. It's an element of influence. But my point is actually, in some ways, it's a reassuring logic, because my view is that economic leverage is very difficult to turn into decisive political influence of the kind that I mean by hegemony, and I define it early on in the book. It's a vague, it's a deliberately not precisely delineated concept, because it's obviously going to be in flux and variable and adaptable and so forth, somewhat subjective and contingent. But the point is that it's very difficult for China has actually failed thus far, not only against Australia, but actually against developing countries like Kenya, to actually translate BRI and related forms of leverage into decisive political influence. And that's encouraging to me, because what that means is that we don't have to fully decouple. We can keep trading with China a lot. I think we're going to have, in the case of the Americans, we're going to have to decouple on things like semiconductors and national security related industry. But we can still trade a lot, because the Chinese won't be able to turn that into decisive. What does turn into decisive political influence is, as Mao said, the barrel of a gun. That actually works. But if we get that right, then we can actually be fairly sanguine. The problem, the flip side of what you're talking about, Gail, and what the implicit logic of what the Biden administration is talking about, and you saw the president say that we are in a battle between democracy and autocracies, is for this to become this competition to become totalized, and for even peripheral conflicts to take on a connotation and a gravity beyond what they actually necessitate. And this is part of the reason my goals vis-a-vis China are actually much more limited. And what I'm not calling for actually like a new Cold War John Foster Dulles thing. I'm calling for a more narrow focus. We need to get ready. We need to be very hard-nosed on that point. But actually, I'm not saying we should fully decouple. I'm not saying the countries have to choose, because I mean, what Biden's saying is, if you're not with us, you're on the side of autocracy. That's whether they say that or not. That's implicitly the message. You mentioned India. Well, I mean, they're alienating the Indians right now. The anti-hegemonic coalition is not about Russia. It's about China. We shouldn't be castigating the Indians about that. I don't think we should be castigating South Korea too much about it. I don't think South Korea signed on to the totality of the sanctions. That's not surprising, because Ukraine's far away from South Korea. It has a lot of other problems, just like India. So, and by the way, the Indians have a long-standing relationship with the Russians. I'm not saying that that's good that they abstain in the UN, but like, let's work realistically with the countries that we can find. On the Russia angle, I mean, I had hoped for many years that we would try to be able to avoid the situation in which we now find ourselves, which is a disastrous outcome. I mean, the basic good sense is not to have the two major Eurasian powers tightly aligned against us. And that's where we are, which is not good. Now, is it possible that we could have avoided it? I think it was possible. It's probably quite difficult. At a minimum, I think we had a reason to try for a distancing. But at this point, it's going to be, we're clearly going to have to take a very firm line on the Russians. Over time, I think it is possible. Actually, one of the points that my partner at the Marathon Initiative makes is that actually, if you look historically at significant changes in Russian foreign policy, they've usually been preceded by a pretty significant defeat. So this could be an opportunity. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it depends on how the Russians take it and how their leadership dynamics go. But fundamentally, China is going to be so powerful that we're going to have to work with a lot of different countries, including ones that we don't particularly like. That's not going to be Russia for the foreseeable future. But we can't afford to alienate Russia and India. I mean, that's like, are you joking, right? I mean, come on. That's a recipe for failure. And we're already on that trajectory, so we can't afford that kind of thing.
Okay. Bridge, there are some series of questions that we're getting from folks who are listening in and watching. Because Jaeyeon can't use her microphone, I'm just going to basically paraphrase her question, which I think is a point that to some extent Gil had touched on, which is how does North Korea fit into all this? Does it fit in at all? Or is it a non-factor when it comes to these broader regional issues? It's very specific to the Korean Peninsula, and so it's not that important anymore. Or is it still important from this regional strategic perspective on China? Do you want to take that first, or do you want to maybe do 3 questions and then go down the line? Let's go with a wave.
Okay.
So after that one, Anthony Kuhn, Anthony, you want to talk? You can speak your question. No, Anthony. Okay. So Anthony asked if China is the main threat, and Taiwan's the main scenario. Why is the US military in Asia still primarily set up for a fight in the Second Korean War with US forces in Camp Humphreys? How does the national defense strategy deal with this? And so again, I guess it's somewhat related.
Sure.
Yeah,
Let
let's
me
go.
take- Okay. No, I think that, I mean, North Korea is not the priority by a long shot. It's China. And I think we increasingly need to look at North Korea and everything on the peninsula through this overarching prism. I mean, that is the fundamental orienting logic that we need to look at things through. In that context, I think the South Korean alliance is on very firm footing. I think both of us, from what I can tell, I mean, I can only really say as an American, but it seems to me we both benefit because if, for the reasons that I mentioned before, South Korea on its own becomes a battleground, an arena for competition, which is not good because you're squashed between mighty, animals and so forth. You could be under the Chinese boot, but that's not going to be very good because as annoying as we can be, we're very far away. The Chinese are right next to, breathing down your neck. So I think from your perspective, it seems to me it works out. From our perspective, it does because we have an established relationship. South Korea is an extremely developed and sophisticated economy. It's tightly connected to the defense of Japan, which is, of course, the kind of cornerstone of our alliance network in the Pacific. I think it's the most important U.S. ally in the world by dint of its size and scale and geography. So that makes a lot of sense for us. But it's going to be looked at through the China prism, and this relates to the question from Anthony, which is our military force on the peninsula should not be focused on North Korea. And I've been saying this for a number of years, that they should be increasingly focused actually on China, whether in a regional context, the potential to surge forces, say to a different scenario, say Taiwan, which I know is touchy, although a number of countries, including Japan and Australia, have moved significantly on this issue, but also for the direct defense of South Korea for the reasons I mentioned, because within the planning horizon for military forces, there will be a direct threat to South Korea from China. And that will be again, I don't think it's likely, I don't know, but it would unlikely be for purposes of direct annexation, but it could be in the way that the United States used its military against Iraq in 2003 to impose a preferred outcome on a recalcitrant country. And I think the kind of force structure and posture that we have in the peninsula, non-stealthy, tactical aviation, large numbers of ground forces that are suited for dealing for the North Korean military, that's not what we want. I think basically the ROC should be primarily responsible essentially for the conventional defense. US should help obviously with nuclear weapons, high-end capabilities, and then primarily focused on the defense of South Korea, along with South Korea's own efforts vis-a-vis Beijing. I think that's going to have to be the planning criterion. Unfortunately, that's not really happening. And that's one of the areas where this pivot doesn't really happen, because often the pivot is a kind of accounting exercise where they tally up forces on the Korean Peninsula, but those are not useful for China. Those are not really going to offer much capability. So they don't really do that much in terms of what to do about North Korea. I don't have a great. I mean, if somebody did have a great answer, I think we'd be in a different position. What I will say is it appears the North does not want to completely be under the thumb of Beijing. I don't think there's any reason to think that we can cooperate with Beijing to resolve the North Korean issue. I think those days are long gone. Anything that happens vis-a-vis North Korea for them as well is going to be through the prism of this geopolitical rivalry. So we shouldn't expect Beijing to do us any favors. But if North Korea doesn't want to be completely a tool and a plaything of China, then there will be some negotiating space, it seems to me.
Okay, that's good. Puram, are you there?
Hey, James, can I quickly respond to what Bridge just said?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I get what Bridge is trying to say, but if you ask the Japanese and South Koreans, North Korea is a critical national security threat. And so whether it's ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons or cyber attacks or whatever, the Japanese, for example, take the NK threat extremely seriously, and that's not going to change regardless of whether the Chinese threat increases, as it will. I think the roles and missions of the US forces in Korea will be modified in the future, as you said, simply because the battle space is expanding. But if you look at the preposition of US forces, having the U.S. second division, in my opinion, in South Korea is crucial because much of the fighting will be done by the South Korean forces. That's been going on since the 1990s. But the key issue here is in the entire Asian mainland bridge, the only place where you have a very large US ground presence is in South Korea. And I think that serves a very crucial purpose because psychologically it reinforces the fact that South Korea is a battlefront state. And I think whatever the Chinese do or do not do vis-a-vis South Korea, the US forces are there to basically constrain both Pyongyang's and Beijing's actions. Overall, I think we need greater maritime assets. Again, this is why I believe that the US Navy, for example, should really build up its assets, for example, particularly in the area around the peninsula, in the Taiwan Straits and Malacca. Because if you have a winnowing American maritime presence in the Western Pacific, it basically denigrates the entire, I guess, deterrence going forward. And I think Poran basically had a question about what should South Korea do in terms of like Taiwan contingency. My quick answer is we have to really ramp up intelligence cooperation with the Japanese and the Americans. The incoming government, President-elect Yoon, has said that he would like to join the Quad if circumstances permit. That's one way forward. And I think what South Korea really needs to do is to really join, if possible, the Five Eyes Intelligence Coordination Group. The Japanese are de facto members. I'm not sure whether the Five Eye countries would want the South Koreans on board for a number of reasons, but that's one thing that the South Koreans should concentrate in terms of being much more alert about what may or may not happen across the Taiwan Strait.
If I could, Chung-Min, I think I actually really agree with you in terms of the threat perception. I think our biggest problem by far, and we're the only ones who can really focus fully on China. I don't deny that you're obviously see North Korea, and in fact, as a more proximate threat, at least now, and Japan sees it also as I think China's the top threat now. But again, this is my logic is, okay, let's work with countries where their interests are and then kind of plug in and play where it makes India, they've got Pakistan or, the Emirates and the Saudis are going to, and the Israelis are going to deal with the Iranians, and we can help. But, where the North Koreans, obviously their nuclear and missile program is very formidable, but their conventional forces, while large, are less of a threat than they used to be. That's something where South Korea can, and I actually think the American, of course, the old adage is don't get in a land war in Asia, right? But South Korea is the exception there. And forward forces are going to be very important because I think one thing that Ukraine shows is the operating environment for projecting power is going to be really lethal. Tanks are getting killed and everything. Large surface vessels are going to have a real problem in the future. Mm-hmm. So actually position is going to be key. And this, I was touching on this in the Philippine context. So forward ground forces and potentially air, certainly missile and air defense, these kinds of things in Korea are critical, but it's more about the type. What are they? And of course, they could have utility against North Koreans, but I think we should be thinking, and this obviously there has to be politically sensitivity, but I think it's important to be clear in our own heads that this is about the Chinese seeing the Americans are there in force too. They're already positioned, they're ready, and of course, the ROC has a very formidable capacity. As for the Japanese, the thing they should do is increase defense spending. If they're worried about the North Koreans and the Chinese as much as they say they are, and when I was doing the 2018 NDS, nobody was more aligned with my thinking, at least, than the Japanese. I'm thinking it doesn't matter if you're aligned and you're not pulling your weight. So finally they might be moving, but I think that needs to happen much more quickly.
Yeah, in terms of the posturing, defense posturing, I think the Biden administration just recently announced the national defense strategy of their own. We expected the nuclear posture review to come out, and I think it was the missile defense review as well. Apparently, they're all sort of together, in a single package. Hopefully, we'll get the unclassified version of the report after it's presented to Congress. But we got a 2-page preview. I think it was last week, and we'll see if some kind of posture shift would be likely, and if so, how that would impact South Korea and the region. There was a question by Poram. There was another part to that question aside from the kind of cooperation that Japan and South Korea can get on. And as she mentioned, is there such thing as an undesirable competition between ROK and Japan? I think you kind of touched on this, Bridge, that you don't really need to have this anti-hegemonic coalition be a multilateral, kind of a NATO setup, where you could have these countries perhaps even compete with one another, and as long as the focus is on denying China's hegemonic ambitions in the region, if that's correct. Maybe you can talk about that.
I'm a little more sanguine on Korean-Japanese rapprochement. If there was ever a period of good relations, I don't know. I mean, I'm not holding my breath, and I mean, I know there's bad blood on both sides, but I tend to say, okay, if we have diplomatic capital, I mean, I know the Obama administration expended an enormous amount of political capital trying to bring Tokyo and Seoul together. And I think to myself, well, I'd rather that the Japanese increase their defense spending. I think the asks with the ROC would be more like what I'm talking about in terms of force posture and arrangements rather than level of effort per se. But, maybe it's just a bridge too far to have rapprochement. If you don't really need it, if you can kind of work around it, which my impression is in talking to, military officers I've worked with and stuff, I don't know if we need, I don't know if, for instance, I think we should replicate with Japan a CFC model, but I don't think we need a trilateral model necessarily, which would probably raise huge flags in South Korea. So that's sort of how I'm, and a similar view, say with Vietnam, like I don't think we need to be interoperable, or with India, we don't need to, as long we can. I mean, South Korea and Japan are obviously close allies, but I mean, let's more work in the spirit of what's going to make them the strongest and most difficult for the Chinese to ingest. Okay, well, they need anti-ship cruise missiles and Stingers and Javelins and whatever. Okay, great. That's what we need to do, and kind of look at it more from a, what are we trying to achieve, and what's the best way with the amount of political and actually financial capital we have available.
So I want to ask one additional question on Taiwan, because you focus on that scenario quite a bit in your book, and here I'm going to ask the question by channeling the ghost of Lee Kuan Yew. I
was born in Singapore, so I'm a sucker for
right. He's talking about this issue a few years back, and when he was asked this question, he pretty much says that there isn't much that the U.S. can do about Taiwan if China decides to take the military route on that question. And he has three reasons for that, right? The 3 points are that first, Taiwan's a core interest for China, and he thinks that it is not for the U.S. And I think you argue against that point in your book. The second point is that China will have greater resolve on Taiwan, so they'll be relentless. That if they fail, they'll come back, try again. I think you talk about that, mentioned that scenario in chapter 9. And finally, the U.S. under certain conditions, and this is kind of akin to what Chung-Min had mentioned about the importance of domestic politics. I mean, suppose we have a scenario where you have an administration in Washington that's decidedly more nationalistic and favors good relations with Beijing because it's more nationalistic and concerned about domestic issues. Suppose that is the case, and perhaps the calculation could be such that that administration may be inclined to find a diplomatic solution or an agreement with Beijing on the Taiwan question instead of engaging in a military confrontation with China. What would your response be? I mean, I've read your book, so I kind of know what your response would be, but what would your response be to that? Because there are some folks here, when you mention the question of Taiwan, that Taiwan is a really a significant problem. Like, it's not happening. There's some folks that would say Taiwan's a really hard nut to crack for China, and for these reasons that people like Lee Kuan Yew has laid out, it's not going to happen.
Well, look, I was a huge fan of Lee Kuan Yew. I didn't agree with everything he said, but I mean, he was. I think somebody said, imagine if Lee Kuan Yew had been president of China instead of Singapore, right? I mean, how history would have been different in the 20th century. So and he had this sort of same, or I try to aspire to that kind of realistic spirit, But I think the one thing about Lee Kuan Yew's point that doesn't make a lot of sense is that China couldn't do it during his lifetime, right? That's the key thing. China's cared about it a lot more than we have the whole time, but they just couldn't do anything about it. So that's the thing that's changed. It's not resolve. It's not core interest. The other thing is it's not a core interest of the United States. They do enjoy an asymmetry of resolve. And this is a point I say to the Taiwanese regularly. I'm very blunt with the Taiwanese that they need to get their setting themselves in gear, because they risk, essentially the way I talk about it is like Taiwan is like a 70%, pick a number, 70% interest for the United States. So it's very important. It's worth fighting for. But if the cost exceeds 70, to use a kind of a sort of a inelegant way of talking about it, then it becomes, we will have to cut them off. We will have to withdraw. I mean, Churchill didn't, and the French didn't want to withdraw from Norway in 1940. Pick your example. They didn't want to withdraw from France at Dunkirk. But if your alternative is complete catastrophe and defeat, they will have to do so. So actually, the Taiwanese really hold their future in their hands, because the biggest lever, in addition to American military focus, is their own effort, and they've been very slow on that. I think the key here, though, James, is and I mean, you go into this a lot in the book, is that's why denial is so important, is that if they can't achieve the level of dominant military advantage on the island, it's going to be very hard for them to convince the people to give up, because they don't want to live under Xi Jinping. A lot of these people are going to go to re-education camps if they're lucky, right? So I think they'll fight like Ukraine. I could be wrong, in which case it'll collapse. But if they fight, the Chinese really have to get over there and force and be dominant. And that is hard. It's doable. I mean, we have been able to launch amphibious invasions for the last most of the last century in Shan, et cetera. But it's hard. It's hard. And it's fragile. I mean, just to take an example, there were no American planes shot down by German aircraft on D-Day, right? I mean, by anti-aircraft fire, yes. But I mean, it showed the level of air superiority. Now, the Chinese are actually moving in the direction of establishing that level of air superiority. So that's the problem. But it is achievable. And if they can't do it, then they can care about it more all the day long. And the problem is, if they can do that, the resolve almost doesn't, the resolve matters. But of course, the Chinese, look at how many people, it's a different China, but look at how many people they threw into the Korean War. And South Korea is 100 miles from China. Philippines is 100 miles from Taiwan. So the same military problem, essentially, that we face will be replicated, especially given that we're not prepared. So this is, to me, Taiwan is not itself of cosmic significance. Taiwan is the canary in the coal mine, or pick your analogy, that if we lose Taiwan, we are going to be in really bad shape. And I think like Japan will have to go to 10% level defense spending. I think South Korea will have to go to 10% level spending, because it's up to you. But at that point, you will know that the Chinese will use military power ruthlessly, and that they have the capability, and that the Americans are not resolute or effective or both enough to defend a country that's fairly similarly situated, because the second division, US forces in South Korea, are not going to survive a determined Chinese assault, right? It's going to have, the big stuff is going to come from elsewhere. The stuff that would deal with the Chinese. So that's going to be a bad world. I would rather that we hold the line where it is, God willing, without a war at all. And I think the best way to do that is to be prepared, and manifestly so to Beijing.
So this last question, and make this short because we're almost out of time, from Lieutenant Colonel Adam Points at USFK. Your book argues that power grows out of gun barrels, but having observed the Ukraine war, and he's not challenging your emphasis on gun barrel by asking this question, but having observed the Ukraine war and how the non-military instruments of power shape the current situation, what are your thoughts on how these could be integrated into a strategy of denial to defend Taiwan?
Well, thanks, Colonel. I talk about this a lot. So one lesson of Ukraine is that denial is what matters. The reason that the Russians are not taking it over is because of the Ukrainian defense, not because of the sanctions or the international condemnation. If that was all the Russians faced, they would be at the Polish border. So this, to me, suggests how important denial is. It's just we're not doing the denial. The Ukrainians are doing the denial. Other forms of power are really important, particularly including in shaping the barrel of a gun. At the end of the day is the force to be reckoned with, I think, as Hobbes put it. But they can be shaped, and I go into this in the book in this idea of the binding strategy, right? That the barrel of a gun, how many guns a country produces, how many it's willing to send to a fight, how many losses of people. Those are political questions that are shaped by things like information, who went first, who's on whose side. I mean, a great example that I always use is, for instance, most Americans on December 6, 1941, did not want to go to war with Japan. 2 days later, not only were they willing to go to war with Japan, but they went to war and we like destroyed the country. And that, after Corregidor and Bataan Death March and all these things, right? So the way a war goes shapes the information. I think this is something that's happened in Ukraine. We see right now the war crimes that appear to have happened in places like Bucha. That's going to further catalyze, and that's leading, it immediately led to the State Department authorizing the dispatch of further javelins. I mean, just to take a small example, but that's, I think, how we net it together. But it comes back down to how does the battle resolve? Because if we don't get the battle, if we don't win the battle, the local battle, then the other stuff's not going to fix it for us.
Well, thanks for closing on that note, Bridge. We're out of time. You gave us a lot to think about. Thank you
Thank you.
to Chungmin and Gil for your insight and input. Thanks to everyone who attended today's webinar and asked a lot of questions. I couldn't go through all of them. Sorry for not getting to 2 of the questions that were asked. I hope you can still contact Bridge, reach out to him individually if you'd like to follow up on a lot of these issues. And thanks to everyone for joining us. But that's all for today. And see you again next time. We've got to do this again. See you guys.
Amen. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Great
Bye-bye.
talking
Have
with
a good
all of
day.
you.
Bye-bye.